Hi, thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. In this video, we're going to read Job 29 through 31 and learn how to avoid unmet expectations. The book of Job tells us about a man named Job who expected to have a life of ease, and he expected the best out of life, and so he was very disappointed when suffering came and he did not have a life of ease. For us, this raises the question, what should our expectations be for life in relating to our prosperity and our health? In this video, we're going to learn that those who follow Christ should lower our expectations because suffering is inevitable and we should be prepared for suffering to come into our life. Now let's take a look at a little bit of context before we get into today's passage. This is a chart of the book of Job. At the very beginning of the book of Job, we're told that Job was blameless, God-fearing, a family man, and wealthy. And let's read the first couple verses, starting at Job 1:1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions also were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. And that man was the greatest of all the men of the East. Now, just for a little context on his wealth, I grew up on a family farm in Pennsylvania, and we had between 100 and 200 animals. Job had over 11,000 animals, and so that gives you the idea of the scale of his wealth. Now, going back to the chart, next the book of Job tells us there was a dialogue in heaven between Yahweh and Satan. And Satan said that the only reason Job followed God and was faithful to God is because Job was wealthy. Satan said if Job lost all his possessions, then he would curse God. So Yahweh gave Satan permission to go out and test Job. So Satan destroyed all of Job's possessions. He killed all of Job's children, and he afflicted Job with boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. Job did not curse God. Job stayed loyal to God. After that dialogue, then 3 friends went to visit Job named Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They had heard about Job's calamity, so they went to comfort him and encourage him. Then there was a long dialogue between these 4 men. Job spoke first, then Eliphaz, then Job, then Bildad, then Job, and that pattern continued. Throughout this dialogue, Job's friends tried to convince Job that he was suffering because he had sinned. They told him that if he would confess his sins, then he would prosper once again. But Job argued that he was not suffering because he had sinned. And Job argued that the reason he was suffering is because God had turned against him for some reason. Now, the passage we're going to look at today is represented by this last red box. And this is the end of the dialogue between these 4 men. And in this passage, Job was speaking, and he started out by reviewing his former prosperity, yearning for the days back when he was prosperous and healthy. And then he contrasted that with his current state, which was a state of suffering and a life of suffering. And then Job offered some proof of why he believed that he was innocent and was not suffering because he had sinned. And throughout this, Job talked about his expectations and how back when he was prosperous, he expected that prosperity and life of ease to continue until his death. And then so he was disappointed when that prosperity did not continue. Now, with that as some context, let's get started with Job 29, verse 1. Now, in these first 6 verses, Job yearned for the former days because he used to have a life of ease and prosperity. And Job again took up his discourse and said, "Oh, that I were as in months gone by, as in the days when God watched over me." Notice this phrase, when God. Throughout the dialogue with his friends, Job had insisted that God used to watch over him and make him prosperous, but the reason he was now suffering is because God had turned against him and was not watching over him anymore. And that's reflected in these statements here, where Job talks about back in the day when God used to watch over him, in contrast to his current state. Verse 3. Back when God's lamp shone over my head, and by his light I walked through darkness, as I was in the prime of my days when the friendship of God was over my tent. When the Almighty was yet with me and my children were around me, when my steps were bathed in butter and the rock poured out for me streams of oil. Remember, Job talked about his children. All of his children had been killed as part of his calamity. Now, starting in verse 7, verses 7 through 10, Job yearned for the former days because he used to be highly esteemed and highly regarded in his community. When I went out to the gate of the city, when I took my seat in the square, the young men saw me and hid themselves, and the old men arose and stood. The princes stopped talking and put their hands on their mouths. The voice of the nobles was hushed, and their tongues stuck to their palate. Notice the reputation, the good reputation that Job had. Then in verses 11 through 17, Job explained why he had a good reputation. It was because he used to take care of the poor and needy. Let's get started at verse 11. For when the ear heard, it called me blessed, and when the eye saw, it gave witness of me. Now let's talk about the word ear and eye. Job was referring to his own ear and his own eye. In other words, when Job was going about in his community, and when people spoke to him, he heard people bless him, or when Job heard people speak about him, he heard people blessing him. And likewise, when Job was out in his community, when he saw how people treated him, they treated him with respect and esteem, and what Job saw gave witness of the fact that Job was a good person. And then notice the word because. The reason he heard people bless him, the reason he saw people treat him with respect, is because of what we see in the following verses. Because I delivered the poor who cried for help, and the orphan who had no helper. The blessing of the one ready to perish came upon me, and I made the widow's heart sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was the eyes of the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I investigated the case which I did not know. Notice the word investigated. If someone went to Job for help and Job did not know if they really needed help, he investigated their case to determine if indeed they needed help. I broke the jaws of the wicked and snatched the prey from his teeth. Now, verses 18 through 20, Job said that he thought that his prosperity would last for the rest of his life. Notice the word then. The word then refers back to the days when Job had been prosperous. Back then, I thought, I shall die in my nest, and I shall multiply my days as the sand. And think about Job's expectations here. The word nest, Job was wealthy. He probably would have had a good home. He had lots of servants. He would have been safe and secure. And that's what he means by his nest. And he thought back then, Job thought that would last the rest of his life, and that he would die within this nest of safety and security. Also, look at this last line. He believed that he would live to be an old man. My root is spread out to the waters and remember, this is what Job used to say back when he was prosperous. My root is spread out to the waters, and dew lies all night on my branch. My glory is ever new with me, and my bow is renewed in my hand. Now, verses 21 through 25, Job talked about how he used to give advice, and everyone would do as he recommended. This is Job speaking. To me, the men in the gate listened and waited and kept silent for my counsel. After my words, the men in the gate did not speak again, and my speech dropped on them. The men in the gate waited for me as for the rain, and opened their mouth as for the spring rain. I smiled on them when they did not believe, and the light of my face they did not cast down. I chose a way for the men in the gate, and sat as chief, and dwelt as a king among the troops, as one who comforted the mourners. And then notice the word but. Job now draws a contrast. In the previous verses, Job talked about his former life back in the days when he was prosperous, and he described what his life was like when he was prosperous and highly esteemed. Now, he has the word but. In the following verses, he's going to describe his current life, where he was suffering, he was not prosperous, and he was not highly esteemed. Now, he starts off, verses 1 through 8, he describes some weak and worthless men whose sons now mock him. But now those younger than I mock me. those whose fathers I disdained to put with the dogs of my flock. Indeed, what good was the strength of their fathers' hands to me? Vigor had perished from them. Now let me explain this. Let's start at the end. Vigor had perished from them. The pronoun them refers back to these fathers, the fathers of these young men who are mocking Job. And he said vigor had perished from them. So these are men that used to have vigor. Now they did not have it. Because they did not have vigor anymore, they didn't have any strength. And because they didn't have any strength, they really weren't useful to Job. Again, this is back when Job was prosperous. There wasn't anything they could do for Job that was a benefit to Job. And because of that, Job disdained to even put them with the dogs of his flock. So these are the men, these old men, these fathers, whose Job is describing down through verse 8. From want and famine they are gaunt, who gnaw the dry ground by night in waste and desolation, who pluck mallow by the bushes, and whose food is the root of the broom shrub. They are driven from the community. The community shouts against them as against a thief, so that they dwell in dreadful valleys, in the holes of the earth and of the rocks. Among the bushes they cry out. Under the nettles they are gathered together. Fools, even those without a name, they were scourged from the land. Notice the word fools. So Job described these old men as fools. Now, verses 9 through 15, Job talked about how now he was being victimized by the sons of these old men that he was just describing. Start at verse 9. And now I have become the taunt of the young men. I have even become a byword to them. The young men abhor me and stand aloof from me, and they do not refrain from spitting at my face. Because God has loosed his bowstring and afflicted me. The young men have cast off the bridle before me. Notice the word because. Job blamed God for all of his calamity. Remember, we know the whole story. We know that Satan was the one that afflicted Job. Job did not know about the dialogue in heaven, so he did not know that Satan really was the one that caused all his calamity. Verse 12. On the right hand, the brood of the young men arises. They thrust aside my feet and build up against me their ways of destruction. They break up my path. They profit from my destruction. No one restrains them. As through a wide breach they come. Amid the tempest they roll on. Terrors are turned against me. The young men pursue my honor as the wind, and my prosperity has passed away like a cloud. Then in verses 16 through 18, Job described how he was greatly afflicted. And now my soul is poured out within me. Days of affliction have seized me. At night my affliction pierces my bones within me, and my gnawing pains take no rest. By a great force my garment is distorted. It binds me about as the collar of my coat. And then in verses 19 through 24, Job said God was the one afflicting him, but when Job cried out to God for help, God did not answer. Start at verse 19. God has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. I cry out to God for help, but you do not answer me. Notice Job switched the first person. Previous to this, Job was speaking to his friends, and he talked about God. Here, Job switched, and now he's talking directly to God. I cry out to you for help, but you do not answer me. I stand up, and you turn your attention against me. You have become cruel to me. With the might of your hand, you persecute me. You lift me up to the wind and cause me to ride, and you dissolve me in a storm. For I know that you will bring me to death and to the house of meeting for all living. Yet does not one in a heap of ruin stretch out his hand, or in his disaster therefore cry out for help? Notice Job basically said that the natural thing for Job to do would be to cry out to God for help. In verses 25 through 31, Job talked about how he had compassion on others, but in return he received affliction. Verse 25. Have I not wept for the one whose life is hard? Was not my soul grieved for the needy? When I expected good, then evil came. When I waited for light, then darkness came. Notice the word wept. Job wept for those whose life was hard. Notice the word grieved. Job grieved for the needy. And if Job was weeping and grieving for the needy and the unfortunate, that tells us that Job truly cared about these individuals. And notice the word expected. Job expected good because of these things Job was doing, because he was weeping and grieving for the poor and needy. He expected good in his life, but instead he got evil. And so his expectations of good did not come true, and he was disappointed. I am seething within and cannot relax. Days of affliction confront me. I go about mourning without comfort. I stand up in the assembly and cry out for help. I have become a brother to jackals and a companion of ostriches. My skin turns black on me and my bones burn with fever. Therefore, my harp is turned to mourning and my flute to the sound of those who weep. Now, chapter 31, verse 1 is a little bit of an interesting verse. This is Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry is about repetition, addition, and contrast. In repetition, a Hebrew poet makes a statement and then says the same thing in a different way. In addition, a Hebrew poet makes a statement and then adds to it. And in contrast, a Hebrew poet makes a statement and then says the opposite. In this particular case, Job makes a statement here. I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? But this is not really connected to the verse previous or the verse after. This verse does not add to or repeat or contrast with what came before it. And likewise, the verse after this does not repeat or add to or contrast with this. And so it's very unusual in Hebrew poetry to have a standalone verse or sentence like this. The reason Job said this is, remember, Job was offering evidence of why he believed that he was not suffering because he had sinned. One of his arguments was that he had made a covenant with his eyes, and as a married man, he was not gazing at virgins who he was not married to. Now, verses 2 through 4, Job said that he believed that God brings calamity to the unjust. Verse 2. And what is the portion of God from above, or the heritage of the Almighty from on high? Is it not calamity to the unjust and disaster to those who work iniquity? Does God then not see my ways and number all my steps? Now notice the question here. Job stated he believed God brings calamity to the unjust, and then Job's question was, so if that is true, or since it is true, why did God not look at Job's ways and realize that Job was a good and upright man and give Job a prosperous and healthy and good life instead of the calamity that Job was currently suffering? Now, verses 5 through 28, there's a series of if-then statements. Job said something like, well, if I did such and such sin, then I deserve such and such consequence. Job's point through here was he was willing to accept consequences. He was willing to accept punishment for his sins if he was guilty of the sins that he's going to list here. But his point was he was not guilty of the sins that he's about to list. Therefore, he should not be suffering as if he was guilty. So let's get started. Verse 5. Again, this is Job speaking. If I have walked with falsehood and my foot has hastened after deceit, then let God weigh me with accurate scales and let God know my integrity. Verse 7. If my step has turned from the way, or my heart followed my eyes, or if any spot has stuck to my hands, then let me sow and another eat, and let my crops be uprooted. Verse 9. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or I have lurked at my neighbor's doorway, then may my wife grind for another, and let others kneel down over her. For lurking would be a lustful crime. Moreover, it would be an iniquity punishable by judges. For lurking would be fire that consumes to Abaddon and would uproot all my increase. Verse 13. If I have despised the claim of my male or female slaves when they filed a complaint against me, what then could I do when God arises, or when he calls me to account? What will I answer him? Did not God who made me in the womb make my slave, and the same one fashion us in the womb? And obviously the answer to this last question is yes. And here, Job said that if he was oppressing his slave, then he should be punished because God made his slave just as well as God made Job himself. Verse 16. If I have kept the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or if I have eaten my morsel alone and the orphan has not shared it. Now, verse 18 is a bit of a parenthetical expression. Here, Job clearly states that he did not do the things to the orphan that he talked about in the previous verse. Verse 18. But from my youth, the orphan grew up with me as with a father, and from infancy I guided her. And then in verse 19, he continues his if-then statement. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or that the needy had no covering, if the loins of the needy have not thanked me, and if he has not been warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have lifted up my hand against the orphan because I saw I had support in the gate, then let my shoulder fall from the socket, and let my arm be broken off at the elbow. For calamity from God is a terror to me, and because of his majesty I can do nothing. Verse 24. If I have put my confidence in gold and called fine gold my trust, if I have gloated because my wealth was great and because my hand had secured so much, if I have looked at the sun when it shone, or the moon going in splendor, and my heart became secretly enticed and my hand threw a kiss from my mouth, then that, being sun worship too would have been an iniquity calling for judgment, for I would have denied God above. Now, verses 29 through 34, Job stated his innocence again. Have I rejoiced at the extinction of my enemy, or exulted when evil befell him? No, I have not allowed my mouth to sin by asking for the life of my enemy in a curse. Have the men of my tent not said, who can find one who has not been satisfied with Job's meat? And Job continued, the alien is not lodged outside, for I have opened my doors to the traveler. Have I covered my transgressions like Adam by hiding my iniquity in my bosom, because I feared the great multitude, and the contempt of families terrified me, and I kept silent and did not go out of doors? Again, the answer is no. And then in verses 35 through 37, Job yearned for an opportunity to plead his case to God. Verse 35. Oh, that I had one to hear me. Behold, here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. And the indictment which my adversary has written, surely I would carry the indictment on my shoulder. I would bind it to myself like a crown. I would declare to God the number of my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. And then in verses 38 through 40, Job used one last if-then statement to claim his innocence. If my land cries out against me and its furrows weep together, if I have eaten the fruit of the land without money, or have caused its owners to lose their lives, then let briars grow instead of wheat, and let stinkwood grow instead of barley. The words of Job are ended. And notice the word ended. This was the end of the dialogue between Job and his three friends. Now let's review a couple verses. Let's go back to chapter 29, verse 18. Remember, the pronoun then refers back to the days when Job had been prosperous and wealthy. And Job said, back then I thought, I shall die in my nest, and I shall multiply my days as the sand. So Job had this expectation that his prosperity and his good health would last the rest of his life, and he had this expectation that he would live a long life and live to be an old man. Now let me ask a question. Do we have the same expectations Job had? When we become prosperous, do we expect that our prosperity will last the rest of our life? If we have a good job, do we assume that our good job will last until we retire? Let's review also chapter 30, verse 25. Have I not wept for the one whose life is hard? Was not my soul grieved for the needy? When I expected good, then evil came. When I waited for light, then darkness came. So again, Job was weeping and grieving for those less fortunate. And because of that, Job expected to have a good life, but he got evil instead. And so he was very disappointed because his expectations were not met. And again, let's ask ourselves, do we do the same thing that Job did? When we treat others well, especially the poor and needy, do we then expect God to reward us and to give us an easy and prosperous life because of what we're doing for other people? Now let's go to 1 Peter 4 and start to look at what our expectations should be, which is a contrast to what Job's expectations were. Starting at in verses 12 through 16, Peter warned us against having the wrong expectations. Verse 12, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing as though some strange thing were happening to you. Notice the word surprised and the word not. Peter said, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal. A fiery ordeal would be some sort of suffering or trial of some sort. Notice the word testing. Peter stated that sometimes the fiery ordeals that we go through, sometimes the suffering and testing that we go through is to test us. Continue at verse 13. But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exultation. Notice the word rejoicing. Peter said that when we're suffering, we should rejoice, which again is the opposite of what Job was doing. Verse 14, if you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer, or thief, or evildoer, or a troublesome meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name. So again, Peter used the word suffer, basically saying if we suffer as a Christian, we're not to be ashamed. And so there's an assumption there that as Christians there will be some suffering. And now let's look at 2 Timothy 3 verse 12. This is Paul writing, Indeed, all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Notice the words will be. Here Paul stated very clearly that there will be persecution. And so as Christians, as followers of Christ, we should expect some persecution. We should expect some suffering. So to review what we've seen, we started off with Job's expectations. At one time, Job had been very wealthy and healthy, and he expected that to continue. He was well regarded in his community, well respected, and he expected that prosperity and that respect to last the rest of his life. Well, it didn't because of that dialogue between God and Satan, and so Job was very disappointed when he began to suffer. In contrast to that, the Bible makes clear to us that as followers of Christ, we should lower our expectations. We should expect suffering because as followers of Christ, suffering will be inevitable. And if we lower our expectations and expect some suffering, then we will not have unmet expectations the way Job did. If you'd like to receive the next episode of Bible Mountain via email, please visit www.biblemountain.com, click on follow, and there will be a place to enter your email address and subscribe to my email feed. This is a free subscription and your email will not be sold nor given away. Also, if you like this video, please use the share buttons on your webpage to like it and or share it with your friends. And once again, thank you for watching BibleMountain.com.